All right, hello again, Ling 201. We're back for our last installment of Morphology, and today what I want to talk about are the sort of other word formation processes that we observe in language, other than the ones we've been talking about so far, which are basically different forms of affixation in sort of different parts of either before or after or within the word. So there's just kind of a set of these that we should walk through so you're familiar with them. We're also going to talk about a phenomenon called allomorphy at the tail end of this lecture, which is also what the quick write for today is about, which is allomorphy in Italian. So I want you to look through these forms and try to figure out what's going on in them with the different forms of the definite article, the, and let me know what you think is happening there. And then by the end of the lecture, we'll come back to this topic. And having learned a little bit more about the general topic of allomorphy on the way. Okay, so with no further ado, what do we need to know? So far in morphology, we've only looked at one type of word formation process, which is basically affixation in different forms. So what I mean by affixation is that you can concatenate morphemes in a row. For some reason, I have a difficult time saying concatenate, but basically you're putting morphemes side by side or next to each other and kind of binding them up into one whole word. So if you put an affix in front of a root, then you get prefixation. If it's after the root, it's suffixation. Within the root, it's infixation, and then around the root, it's circumfixation. We already know that. I'm not going to dwell on it any longer. But I will let you know that there are many other different ways to make new words without concatenating morphemes together. And some of these are kind of similar to concatenation, but not quite the same thing. Or at least they're not quite the same thing as affixation. And then others just make entirely different changes to the word to create a new word. So I'm going to walk you through these one by one and give you a variety of different examples. And it's just kind of a fun little ride. So here we go. The first of these is probably the one word formation process that is most similar to affixation, and it's called compounding. And you've probably heard about this before in English because we make use of it a lot. So in this case, we're not combining, say, a root and an affix or a free morpheme and a bound morpheme together in concatenation. Instead, we are binding together two or more free morphemes to make a new word. So a pretty straightforward example of this is the word baseball, which comes from the combination of the word base and ball. Put those together, you get one whole word, baseball. Similarly, a blackboard or a light bulb. A relatively new version of this is the word podcast, which didn't exist 20 years ago. So this is a pod combined with a cast over the internet, and people are talking about their own thoughts and ideas, and nobody listens. So compounding is very common in the world's languages, and like I said before, it's common in English for sure. German is another example of a language that likes compounding. So this is kind of an interesting contrast a little bit if you know some French. French is not so big on compounding, or rather what French tends to do is, create kind of new phrases out of individual words, like fleur de lis or something like that is three whole words, whereas German just like throw it all in there and we'll create one gigantic word, like say Donau Dampfschifffahrtgesellschaft, which means Danube Steamship Excursion Company. So each one of these words is a word in and of itself, Donau Dampfschifffahrtgesellschaft, but when you combine it into one big word like this, is the Danube Steamship Excursion Company, like some sort of tour boat company or something like that, which is pretty fun. I don't know exactly how many letters are in this word, but it's a lot. And German does this all the time. So you see a lot of long words in German like this. I think looking through this, Gesellschaft is a complex word. So you could kind of break this one down too, but if you did, Schaft is sort of a bound morpheme here, and Gesell is the other part of that. So we're only looking at the free morphemes here when we put words together in compounding. Okay, so just to let you know, one thing that happens in compounding is that we get some phonological changes or sound changes in how we pronounce these words that we're putting together. So there's a shift in the stress pattern on a word like blackbird as opposed to a whole phrase like blackbird. So there's a bird out there. I don't know if it's a raven or a blackbird or a crow, but it's black, so it's a blackbird. But if it were a specific kind of blackbird, it could be a blackbird. And I could also talk about, say, a bulb, like a flower bulb that I'm going to plant in the garden, but it's not very heavy, so it's a light bulb. I don't know why I would say that, but it's not the same thing as a light bulb, which is the thing you screw in the socket to give you light inside your house. So in light bulb and blackbird, we get stress on the first syllable in these compound words, but this is a whole phrase. This is an adjective followed by a noun, so we're stressing the nouns in these particular phrases. You can also kind of test this in some cases by trying to see if you can put a adjective in front of or an adverb in front of the compound noun. So because these phrases are an adjective followed by a noun, in theory you could have an adverb which modifies the meaning of this adjective and place it in front of the whole thing. But you can't do that if the whole thing is a noun, like blackbird, because adverbs don't modify nouns. You need to have like an adjective instead. So we can talk about like an extremely gentle man. That works. Extremely is modifying the meaning of gentle here, or the very white house. But you can't talk about an extremely gentleman, right? Because this is a noun, so an adverb doesn't fit in there. Or you can't talk about the very White House, like the place where Trump lives, because this is not really functioning as an adjective here, this word white. It's functioning as a part of this compound, White House. Yeah. It's also possible to form other kinds of compounds. So we're taking an adjective and a noun and squeezing them together here. In some of these other cases, we were looking at like combinations of nouns like base and ball, so on and so forth. I've got a few examples down here of verb and adjective compounds. So drop kick, those are two verbs you put together, like in soccer or maybe obscurely football. Spoon feed, I guess that's a noun and verb, and whitewash, so on and so forth. But these form verbs at the end of the day. Nationwide is a compound adjective. So that's a noun and an adjective. Or red hot, I guess those are two adjectives together. So there's a lot of different lexical categories that can get squeezed together to form compounds in English. Yeah, so it's a pretty productive and, like I said, widespread process in the language. A different kind of word formation process is called back formation. So this is kind of funny. This is sort of people being amateur linguists and doing it the wrong way, or I guess amateur etymologists and trying to figure out how a word was formed and then not understanding it. So an example of this is editor. So this looks like one of those cases of our familiar morpheme just being added on to something at the end, or a root verb like edit. So editor, like it's spelled with an O, right? So that's kind of a clue that it's not quite the same thing as like editer. But when you hear it, you can't tell the difference. So this is the word that originally existed, editor. And just looking at it, I'm assuming it comes from some Latin root, which I should probably look up, but I don't know off the top of my head. But it does not mean, like historically, like somebody who edits. But when you say this out loud in English, it sounds like somebody who edits. So that got sort of unpacked into the verb edit, followed by the person who edits, like a newspaper or something. Similar examples like peddler inspired the verb peddle, or burglar inspired the verb burgle. Swindler inspired the word swindle. Peas is kind of a funny thing. So there used to be just kind of what we call a mass noun, like when you eat peas as your vegetable for dinner or what have you, it's just a group of like little green balls of vegetable. And that just used to be peas, like, oh, I'm eating mashed potatoes, right? It's just like a glump of stuff. But instead, people heard that as like peas, like multiple individual peas, like 1 pea, 2 peas, so on and so forth. So because there's lots of individual little vegetables in there, or like spheres. So the word pea came out of that, where you have just one of those things and you call it a pea, I guess. Liaison inspired liaise. Some of these are not super frequent words, but they exist. Or lazy inspired laze, which is like a verb form of just, hanging out and not doing much. But lazy is the original adjective. A reverse back formation, which is kind of interesting. So apparently in the old days, like the 1800s, if you wanted to talk about somebody from China, you could call them a Chinese. like an individual person from China was a Chinese. And so then I guess if you have multiple Chinese persons, then you have Chinese people. So that's sort of like adding the plural morpheme S to the end of Chinese to get Chinese. So there's lots of Chinese in the world, I guess. Yeah, so that's kind of going the opposite way. But ultimately, what's happening in back formation is that you're taking off an incorrectly perceived affix to form a new word. So this is the opposite of concatenation. It doesn't even make sense, but it's what people do anyways. I've got some more examples here. This is where somebody's playing around with this concept. So this is a guy who coincidentally has the last name Winter, who wrote this short story just for fun, How I Met My Wife. And it goes, it had been a rough day, so when I walked into the party, I was very chalant. Despite my efforts to appear gruntled and consolate, I was furling my wieldy umbrella when I saw her. She was a descript person. Her hair was kempt, her clothing shoveled, and she moved in a gainly way. Yeah, actually, I will mention as I'm walking through this. So there are other words, the bigger words, where these individual words come from, right? So chalant comes from nonchalant, or gruntled comes from disgruntled, so on and so forth. This word shoveled, the bigger word is disheveled. But when I was young, I didn't know that. And it turns out my mom didn't know that either. So when you write it out, actually I'll write it out. The original word is disheveled, like that. But I always heard it, or my mom said it too, as disheveled. So like something, I guess, could be heveled if it was in order and cleanly or something like that. Or at least had shaved recently. But that's not how you pronounce the word. It's not disheveled, it's disheveled. And this guy pulled apart the dis part of that to make sheveled, whatever that means. So there's more of that short story here. I've also got a clip here. This might not make it through YouTube's copyright catcher. We'll see. I've had very little success with that so far, but I'd actually be surprised if it does, because it's a short clip. It's from a movie that came out about 20 years ago, which is on the above average side of entertaining, and you might remember it, or who knows. Here we go.
I know you can be overwhelmed, and you can be underwhelmed, but can you ever just be whelmed? I think you can in Europe.
Yeah, so who knows what it would mean to be whelmed, but that possibility is at least linguistically out there if you are into back formations. Okay, reduplication. That's another word formation process where you repeat all or part of the stem to create a larger word. So this is a process which is productive in a lot of different languages. And there are examples of it in English. It's just not that common. It's fairly common. It's not something we regularly use. So in Indonesian, total reduplication, as it's called, is how you make the plural of nouns. So in Indonesian, the word for house is rumah. If you want to say houses, you just say that word twice, rumah, rumah. Or mother is ibu. If you want to talk about mothers, it's ibu, ibu. Fly is lalat. So lalat, lalat is flies, so on and so forth. I think you can see the pattern, right? You just take the whole word and you say it twice. That's what we call total reduplication, where you repeat the whole thing. Tagalog, which is spoken in the Philippines and also many other places in the world like Canada, is a language which has partial reduplication. And in this, you repeat part of the original word to create a larger word. So in Tagalog, we have a verb buy. And if you want to say, so the word for buy is bili. And if you want to say will buy, you say bibili. And hopefully, actually, I'll walk through these and maybe you can see the pattern. But eat is kain and will eat is kakain. Enter is pasok and will enter is papasok. So hopefully you've caught on to this by now, but it's not, will buy is not bili bili. You just take the first syllable in these words and you repeat that at the beginning. So pa is the first syllable of pasok, ka is the first syllable of kain, so on and so forth. That's what you reduplicate to create these words. Yeah, so I don't know to what extent this is what we call an areal feature of language. Indonesia and the Philippines are pretty close to each other, so but I don't, as far as I know, they're not related to one another. I should look that up again. But oftentimes in our study of languages, we note that there are sort of features that languages have in common because they are descended from some historical ancestor, which is similar between them, like say English and German. But then there's other cases where languages just have similarities between them because they're just sort of in the same vicinity as each other, and otherwise don't have a historical relationship between one another, which is kind of interesting. But so that's called an areal feature when we get that. I'll give you an example, setting that aside, of reduplication in English. So like I said, there are a few examples of reduplication in English. Normally in class, this is where I ask if you can think of any. And I'm going to ask that again now because I'm planning on playing this again for everybody to watch together. But I will let you think about it while I take a drink. Couldn't think of any reason to bring Winnie the Pooh into this lecture, so I'll just have a little Winnie the Pooh break, and just, here we go. He's the cameo star of the show, like Alfred Hitchcock. What are any examples of reduplication in English? There's a lot when you stop and think about it. So we have like expressions like bling bling. I don't know how popular it is to say that again, or in the modern day and age, but fancy jewelry can be called bling bling. Very, very, teeny weeny, a little something something, so on and so forth. There's lots of little phrases like that, like that we use where we get kind of partial reduplication, like in teeny weeny, or sort of total reduplication, like in very, very, so on and so forth. There's also one reduplicative process in English which is productive. Maybe I should put it that way. And maybe you thought of this when I was asking you about this, because we can use this for a lot of different forms, but it's called schma reduplication. So the classic canonical example is like fancy schmancy, you and your fancy schmancy teddy bear or whatever, or your fancy schmancy car or house, whatever. You can apply this to other, words or phrases like tired schmired, whatever, get out there and get back to work. Football, schmootball, who cares? Nobel Prize, schmobel Prize is not a big deal. So what we're doing here, and again, you kind of have to think about this in terms of how it's working out with the sound. Fancy schmancy, we're getting rid of the first syllable in the word, or the first sound in the word, the F, and replacing it with schma, which is why this is called schma reduplication. So yeah, and that's the case in every single one of these. In every single example, we just get rid of the first letter or sound, like T in tired, or the F in football, the N in Nobel Prize. Put schma there, and you're ready to go. It gets a little bit interesting, and people have actually done formal analyses of this about what happens when you have sort of more than one consonant sound at the beginning of a syllable. So, like, if you had, say, the word sprain, and you wanted to say, I guess, imply that a sprained ankle is not a big deal. Like, do you say sprained ankle, schmained ankle, or do you say schmained ankle? I don't know. You can tell me what you think, but that's an interesting question we can set aside for future units when we talk about phonology. Anyways, so this is kind of fun, but it's an example of reduplication in English. As somebody has pointed out in this class before as well, it's probably an influence of Yiddish language in English. In Yiddish is the language which was widely spoken by the Jewish diaspora throughout many countries of the world. It's a language which is related to German ultimately, but has basically a Jewish flavor to it. And it's not spoken by Jewish people quite so much anymore because in the modern world, Hebrew has kind of become more influential again as a sort of the Jewish universal language. But its influence still remains in little examples like this, which is kind of fun. All right, a slightly more common word formation process in English is internal change. This is where you change sounds inside a root to create a new word. And this can also be called alternations. And we have a lot of examples of this in forming the past tense of certain verbs, and also a few pluralizations of nouns. But let's say you wanted to form the past tense of the verb sing. I sing, you sang, so on and so forth. You're changing the vowel here from the I to the A. What you're not doing is what we normally do for forming the past tense of English verbs, and you're not adding ed to the end of this. So it's not I sing, you singed. It's instead, it's I sing, you sang. Or I drive, you drove. You did not drived. so on and so forth. Foot, feet, that's an example of going from the singular to the plural, or mouse to mice. Import to import. So these last two are a little bit different because you're not changing specific sounds you're using in the middle of these words, and instead you're shifting the stress from the beginning to the end. So import to import. Import is a noun, import is a verb, present is a noun, present is a verb, so on and so forth. I mentioned German a little bit before, and I also talked about how English and German are related historically. This is a process that's pretty widespread in the German language as well. In German, it's called Umlaut. So you might be familiar with German spelling and the spelling of a few other German languages as well, where they put, in some cases, 2 dots over a vowel, like A or O. And that sort of represents this change that they get in going from present to past tense in some German verbs. And those 2 dots over the vowel are called the umlaut. That's what it means. It just means kind of circumsound, I guess you would say, as a translation for English. Sound around, changing the sound around to get something new, just to indicate a different tense of the verb. So you're not really adding a morpheme as we normally think about it here. You're just making a change to the root. I will say that some of these alternation or internal change processes have limited productivity in English. I'll see if I can kind of convince you of that with these examples. So what's the past tense of sing? We just talked about that. It's sang. And the past participle is sung. So I sing, you sang, he has sung. Or ring. I ring, you rang, he has rung. What about bring? I bring, you brang, maybe not. The official formal way of saying that is brought. So you brought, or he has brought, or she has brought, or whoever has brought. But sometimes in informal language, you might hear people say, he brang it, or he brung it, whatever. So you can get kind of bring, brang, brung from some speakers, basically as an analogy for the way that sing, sang, sung works, or ring, rang, rung works as well. Okay, that might not be you, but I bet you probably have heard that at some point along the way. Yeah, so that leads me to this internal change quick write, which is the quick write we talked about or played around with last time. So the design of this is to try to get you to sort of try to induce you to produce certain internal changes for these made-up verbs in these particular examples. And with new verbs, or made-up verbs, it's kind of easier to do that because you might not know exactly how to produce the past tense, and so you're kind of using analogies with other existing verbs to create past tense that sounds similar. I'm recording this again. It's now the beginning of August, so summer is whiling away as we speak, but I'm recording this before I've actually had you do this quick write, so I'm going to walk you through the results of the quick write from last year right now, and then I'll give you updated data when you guys do it, presumably end of September, early October sometime. But last year I got 84 total responses from that quick write, and then I'm just counting how many different sort of irregular or internal change responses I got. So the first one is not really an example I expect everybody to do, but it's the verb bive, like did you bive? And one person said, yes, I bathe. Yeah, don't know entirely where that came from, but yeah, did you vake? Yes, I voke. So that's kind of like wake and woke, something like that. One person just used vake, which is not making any change at all. One person said voked. Most everybody else said vaked. Did you slike? Yes, I sloked. Yes, I sloke. Yes, I slake. So we're getting a few of these responses. Did you neek? Yes, I noked. Yes, I nake. Yes, I neek. Yes, I noke. Yes, I not. So this person's being pretty clever here for sure. Yeah, I don't know exactly how you make that analogy, but say if you think of neek as like speak or something like that, you can say, did you speak? Yes, I spoke. Something like that. Maybe that's where a form like that is coming from. Neek, maybe not sort of as an analogy with like teach, taught, perhaps. You get a lot more irregular responses for these final verbs. Did you mide? Yes, I mowed. This is sort of like, did you ride? Yes, I rode. Or maybe instead you think this is more like, did you hide? Yes, I hid. So yes, I mid, so on and so forth. And then there's a few others here as well. Did you strink? This one usually gets a lot of irregular responses. So yeah, did you strink? Yes, I strunk. Or strank. So this is maybe a little bit like drink and drank and drunk, so on and so forth. Sometimes I talked about think going to thought. That's another pretty irregular one. Sometimes you can hear people joking about think, thank, thunk. Yes, I thank, or thunk, I've thunk. I don't know. And then there's some people are getting funny here. Again, you see that sort of think, thought example here with strink, distraught, so on and so forth. Yeah, I have strinked here, but that should be okay. Did you run? Yes, I ran. So this is sort of like run. Did you run? Yes, I ran. So by analogy with these existing verbs that have irregular changes in them, you might get new irregular changes for these made-up words. So they're not, I'm calling that irregular when we do internal changes because it's not following the rule where we just add ed to the end of the verb. But there's a certain amount of regularity in them, which can be applied to new forms of the language. It's just not as common as sort of the broader regularity of just add this affix and make it simple that way. Yeah, so in the old days, when German and English were the same language like 1,000 years ago or however long ago it was, that language like Anglo-Saxon or the Germanic languages typically created past tenses of verb forms by using processes like these, but over time that's evolved to sort of do it the regular way we do it by just adding the past tense suffix. But that sort of change in the language is not entirely complete. Normally, when we have these internal changes like for sing or sang or ride or rode, they're for pretty common verbs that we use a lot. And so that sort of irregular pattern gets reinforced through a lot of repetition. I'll give you another example of sort of an extreme form of internal change that we find in Semitic languages like Arabic and Hebrew. So I talked a little bit about Yiddish a while back. Hebrew is sort of the more widely spoken language amongst the Jewish people of the world these days, and you might not know that Arabic and Hebrew are actually historically related to one another. They're called Semitic languages and kind of both emerged in the Middle East, where Arabic and Jewish people live. And they both share this feature of root and pattern morphology. So in Arabic, there is what's called a root, sort of similar to the roots we've been talking about in morphology, except in Arabic, this is just 3 consonants in a row. And there are different roots throughout the language which work in similar patterns, but the one that is often used in examples like this is the root KTB, which means right. So the trick with this is that you kind of have to have these consonants in this order, but then depending on where you put the vowels in the middle of them, it means a variety of different things. So there's a word kitab, which means a book, or kutub is how you say books. Al-kitab is the book, or author is katib. Maktab is office, maktaba is library, kataba is to write, kataba is to make write, kataba is to correspond, uktaba is to dictate. All of these have semantic meanings that are similar or related to the idea of writing in some fashion. And you can see in every single one of these cases, we have a KTB in some order. Sometimes you double or make longer particular consonants, but they're all there. And then they kind of get interspliced with different vowels as we go. So there's a lot there. And there's a lot you'd have to learn if you were acquiring this language as, well, either a native speaker or a non-native speaker. So it's pretty fascinating, say, if you're a linguist, to try to figure out exactly how this all works. One fun fact about both of these languages is that they are typically written without vowels. You can, if you really feel like you need to, write them with vowels by putting little diacritics over the letter symbols, but normally that's not done. You can kind of get the meaning you really want to get out of these root consonants, and then you have to kind of, I guess, figure out the rest, either from context or just experience, I suppose. So writing systems can work in different ways there, and it's nice that we're talking about writing systems with a verb like write. Another example of a word formation process is conversion, where you use an existing word in a new lexical category. So English makes use of this process a lot, to the maybe consternation of non-native speakers again, because there's a lot, I guess, of new adaptations you have to make in order to understand what's going on here. So take a word like butter, and maybe we can kind of canonically think of butter as like this stick of dairy product that we spread over bread or what have you. So it's a noun, but you can butter something up or spread butter on something, which is to butter like a piece of bread. Then you're turning butter into a verb in that particular case. Or to nail, like a nail is a little spiky thing that you put or drive into a piece of wood to hold it together with something else, but you can nail in the nail using a hammer, so that's a hammer going to, or a noun going to a verb. A report is originally a verb, so you report somebody to the police or something, but then you could file a report for that reason, which is a noun. Some examples of adjectives going to verbs, like to total a car is when you completely destroy it so it can't be used again. So total is like an adjective meaning everything, but when you destroy everything in a car, it's totaling the car, so on and so forth. A recent conversion, which has happened in the last few years, which is kind of fun, is ghost. So back in the good old days, ghost was just a noun. It was, some spectral spirit that would haunt you in the nighttime or in your dreams, whatever. But now it's, somebody who just checks out of a relationship, I guess. So you can ghost somebody by just never speaking to them again, and then you become the spectral shape that haunts them. So that's going from a noun to a verb. So like I said, this happens a lot in English, and it's still happening to this day. There's probably more recent examples, which I haven't currently thought about, but maybe you know of, because we can expect this to keep coming. Yeah, I'm not going to say anything more about tile and carpet, but here's some examples that I've caught while watching football on Sunday afternoons. But you can talk about the noun defense, which in football announcerese has been changed to a verb, which means to sort of knock down a pass without catching it. So Sanders defends the pass. Or there's also the verb contain, like normally you contain people within some area, but in football, that gets converted to a noun. You can talk about, say, Urlacher lost weak side contain, which, sounds funny when you hear it, but it makes sense. So you can use it. A long while ago in Hurricane Katrina in 2005, I got this quote from somebody down in New Orleans who said, "We heard that there was a gentleman who was stuck in his boat just downstream from us, so we're efforting to help rescue agencies find him." So effort is normally a noun, but this guy's using it as a verb to mean like trying, I guess, hard. But again, like I say, some of these sound pretty awkward when you hear them the first time. This one didn't really seem to catch on, and I don't really mind that too much. But at least I got it as an example for how this process works in English. So here's an example of Calvin from Calvin and Hobbes doing the exact same thing. So Calvin says, "I like to verb words." What? "I take nouns and adjectives and use them as verbs. Remember when access was a thing? Now it's something you do. It got verbed. Verbing weirds language. Maybe we can eventually make language a complete impediment to understanding." Yeah, so there's lots going on here, like verb being used as a verb and going from a noun to an adjective. But weird is a noun to a verb. In this case, weird is going from an adjective to a verb because Calvin's happy to verb any kind of word. And like Hobbes says, language isn't necessarily designed to make people understand each other. It's just a system that has that possibility within it. Okay, moving right along. Suppletion. Suppletion occurs when inflected forms of word have different roots. So this is sort of a more dramatic form of internal change. And in English, this doesn't happen that often. As you might imagine, this is kind of tricky when you're changing a word this dramatically for people to kind of catch on that it means the same thing as a related word. So normally when we form the past tense of verbs in English, like I've said before, you just add the ed suffix to it. So walk goes to walked, cook goes to cooked. But for the verb go, you say went. So I go, you went. Or be, and be is a really weird verb because it has so many different forms, but I am and you were. So those are both nothing like each other, and they're also nothing like this root form be either. So there's a lot of arbitrariness here in the morphology, on top of sort of the general lexical arbitrariness we have in language. Here's some examples of this sort of thing from Portuguese, and again, it's from a similar verb to go as well as the verb to eat. So in Portuguese, to go is ir, I go is vou, I went is fui, I was going is ia. So these don't really look all that similar to each other, but they all mean go. It just depends on sort of what tense and subject you're using them with. Comer is to eat, como is I eat, comi is I ate, comia is I was eating. So this is an example of when you don't get this sort of suppletion, because you can see the root is pretty similar across the board here, the com. More dramatic changes going on here. This reminds me, or brings me to the topic of child verb morphology. So it's interesting to see how these things play out in child language acquisition. So the one pattern that people have noticed that kids often do, not always, but generally speaking, you see something like this, is that in sort of the early stages of language acquisition, when they're sort of picking up individual words, you might hear a child say, I go, or I went for the past tense. Again, they're not going to get the sounds perfect when they're at this stage, but they get the general idea across. And then there's a stage, which we're probably all familiar with, where a child might start saying, I go, I goed, or he goed, or what have you. So that's kind of funny, but remarkable. And then at stage 3, the child might go back to where they were at stage 1, where they're getting the past tense the way the adults say it, and they say, I go, you went, so on and so forth. So what do you guys think is going on here? What's the child doing as a language learner? What exactly is happening at stage 2 such that this changes, and then why do they go back? Pause for a second. Let you guys think about it. But I think I'll tie this back in with the idea of regularity and also arbitrariness in morphology. So these two are arbitrarily related to one another. You kind of have to learn sort of almost a different word for each tense, at least a different word form completely for each tense. But these two are systematically related to one another, right? Goed, goed. You're just adding that ed affix to it, just like you do for every single other verb. So it's tricky. Go and went are really frequent verbs. We hear them a lot, especially if you're a kid. So you probably get a lot of examples of both to start off with, and you can learn them both as sort of specific to the present and past tense form. But then as the child grows older, they start to learn more regular verbs that sort of form the past tense this way. So at some point the child's like, well, why don't I just do this with go as well and say I goed, or I bide, or whatever. And so they kind of over-apply that rule to forms that the adults will not sort of use the rule for. And then as they keep going, eventually they get enough examples of go to realize that, well, this regular rule doesn't apply to it, so we have to kind of stick with the arbitrariness that we learned at the beginning. So this is an example of overgeneralization by kids, which is kind of a common phenomenon when a kid is just growing up. So in acquiring language. So I remember my nephew a long time ago, his dad was a pilot in the Air Force when he was very young. So my nephew was really interested in planes kind of for that reason, and would often look up in the sky to look for planes. But my nephew overgeneralized the concept of planes to be like anything in the sky. So I remember walking around with him when he was like 2 years old, and he looked up at the moon. It's like, airplane. And I'm like, I didn't want to correct him, and I didn't correct him, but it was just kind of funny to think of the moon as an airplane. I was like, you'll figure it out eventually, David. I saw my own child do this last week. My wife sent me a video of her walking to the park, and there was sort of one sequence where like another child and her mother walked past them, and my daughter waved at them. And then they went a little further down the way, and then she saw the park where she was going, and she waved at the park as well. Yeah, you just wave at things that you like, I guess. But kids overgeneralize until they find like the limits of how much they should generalize. Another example is clipping, where you shorten an existing word. So there's lots of examples of this in English as well. Take the word demonstration, you can create demo from that, or condominium, condo, information, info, facsimile, fax. Don't know how much people use faxes anymore, but that's where it came from originally. Deli is from delicatessen. Lab is from laboratory. Lang is from constructed language. This is kind of like a clipped compound, I guess you could say. So it's taking the con from constructed and lang from language. A conlang, which I guess you're not likely to know since you're taking this class, or maybe you are, but it's a language like Esperanto or Volapük, which is just a language that somebody made up from scratch. So it's a constructed language rather than a natural language. One of my favorite examples of these that I'll mention as we go is the word or term taxi cab. So this comes from taximeter cabriolet. So taxis were first invented about 1900 or so. That's when they first started becoming widespread. So before 1900, you had horse-drawn carriages, which were known as cabriolets. So you get the cab from that part. And the taximeter is actually, when you get into a taxi and there's the meter, which shows you how much money you owe, that's the taximeter. So we normally think of taxi as like the whole car or vehicle that you ride in to pay somebody to drive you somewhere else. But technically taximeter or taxi comes from taximeter, which is that specific meter. And who knows in the days of Uber or whatever if this concept will stick around, but that's at least where it came from for the time being. Blending is where you meld together parts of two different words to get a blend. Sometimes these are called portmanteaus or portmanteau as well. You may have heard that word. There's lots of examples like these in language. People kind of create them often to sort of seem clever. So we get the word brunch from breakfast and lunch, and it comes with a slice of cantaloupe at the end. We have smog, which comes from smoke and fog. So we get the first part of smoke and the last part of fog, and we wind up in LA. Or spam, which comes from my home state of Minnesota, originally comes from spiced and ham. So the sp part from that and the am from ham. So kind of taking the first part of one word and the last part of the other. That's where most of these, or how most of these are formed. Like telethon, it's from television and marathon. Chortle is a funny one. It comes from Lewis Carroll, who invented a number of these words when he was writing books like Alice in Wonderland. So chortle is complex because it combines the word chuckle and the word snort. So it's taking kind of the outsides of chuckle and the inside, or the last part of snort to get chortle. Most blends don't work that way. A more common one is motel, from motor and hotel. So that's a hotel you can drive to in your own car, like on a 50s road trip. Chillax, I used to use as an example as a neologism in this class, a new word formation. I haven't heard anybody use chillax for a while, but it eventually came from chill and relax. So bankster is one I got from a student who said it's a combination of a banker and a gangster. And this is kind of something that came up during the financial crash at the end of the 2000s. Sort of bankers who were up to no good. I kind of like that one. Another one I got from a student is bricked, which is a combination of brilliant and wicked. So I guess this is super awesome, as we might have said back in my day. And it's a pretty cool word too, a bricked word. All right, a few more. Coinage is where you just completely make a new word up. And an example of this, which has recently become more popular, is like snarky. Don't know exactly what the etymology of that is. If you go further back, the word dog is interesting. So like I said, English and German are historically related. So in German, the word is Hund for a dog. And we have a related word in English for that, like hound, which I don't think anybody would really use anymore if they just saw a dog running around. But we still get that in terms of like the names of breeds for dog. And then somehow, like in the 1500s or 1600s, people in the English-speaking world just started saying dog for this creature. And nobody knows where it came from, but that's the word. So yeah, you can make up a new word even for a pretty common concept, and it might catch on. Eponyms is where a word is named after people. So for instance, a boycott is named after, I think his first name was Jeffrey Boycott. Maybe I'm confusing him with like a cricket player. But there was a guy who first came up with the concept of boycott to sort of like not, frequent place of business. So you kind of put them out of business or force them to do what your political will is or whatever it is. A kind of funny example is the word crapper. So one of the first inventors of the toilet, his last name was actually Crapper. So this is a slang word for a toilet. And then we also get a back formation out of this, right? So we have the word crap, which means the specific thing that comes out of the process of going to the toilet. But the guy's name was Crapper. He was not a person who craps. So there's a lot going on with that one. Sideburns is kind of funny. So there was a general in the Civil War, the American Civil War, whose name was Ambrose Burnsides, and he had, as was the case as was the style in those days, sort of really long sideburns, mutton chops really coming down to his cheeks. So his name was Burnsides, but they saw the hairstyle and eventually started calling them sideburns, I guess because they're on the side of your head. So that's another word just named after somebody specific who's related to the concept of the word. It's an eponym. An acronym is where you create a word out of an abbreviation. So that we know a lot of these. The word scuba is an abbreviation. Every single one of these letters means something more, or is it the beginning letter of an individual word. I'm not going to tell you what it is. I think some of you may probably already know. If you don't know, you're welcome to look it up. Another one is radar, like is radio detection and ranging or something like that. So these individual letters mean something. I can't remember exactly what laser means, but it works the same way as like scuba, where each one of these letters is the first letter of a larger word. That is an acronym. Yeah, and we also get that with, terms like the CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, or what have you. Last but not least, I'll point out that sometimes an affix can change form depending on what kind of root it attaches to. So I'll walk you through an example of this with the English prefix in, which combines with adjectives to form other adjectives, and it means the opposite of. So this is a nice example because it's pretty clear what it means, and the rule is pretty straightforward as well because we're not changing the lexical category of the word. The tricky part is that the sounds involved in this prefix can actually change as you have it go through the word formation process. So the basic forms, if we have an adjective like accurate or tolerant or direct, we can say inaccurate, intolerant, indirect, and they mean exactly the opposite of what the original forms mean, and the prefix sort of stays the same as we'd expect it to. But sometimes we get this phenomenon known as allomorphy. So we can add in to a word like legible, and then all of a sudden we get illegible. Or we can add in to regular, and then we get irregular. Or in to legal, and then we get illegal. We don't get illegal or irregular or illegible. That would be just weird. So what do you think is going on here? I'm going to take a little pause, get another drink of water. Why is this change happening? Or at the very least, can you describe what change is happening? And then after that, we might be able to figure out what is, or what the reason is behind it. Well, we get two new forms of the affix, ill and ir, and they only appear based on the shape, phonetic shape of the root word that they're attaching to. So first of all, when we have these two new forms, they're called allomorphs, which basically means different forms. This again is derived from ancient Greek, where morphs means form, or morph means form. Allo means different. And so we'll see this sort of construction again. But now we have three different forms of this prefix, in, ill, and ir. And the ir is only going to attach to roots that begin in r, and the ill is only going to attach to roots that begin in l. So just keep that in mind. I'll show you some other changes which can happen to this particular prefix. So if we add this guy to probable, then we get improbable. If we add this guy to mobile, then we get immobile, or to possible, then we get impossible. So this is weird. So I think hopefully you were able to see this pattern fairly well here, right? So L and R, the special thing that happens is that N at the end of the prefix just changes into whatever the first letter of the root is. So if it attaches to a word that begins with L, then it becomes an L itself. If it attaches to a word that begins with R, it becomes an R itself. But here, this is something different because the N is not changing to a P when it's dealing with a word that begins in a P. It does change to an M at the beginning of immobile, the M at the beginning of mobile inspires the N to change to an M. But here in impossible, we get this change to M again, which is kind of funny. So I will pause again and ask you to think about this. What's going on with improbable, immobile, and impossible? And we know at this point to think about what the beginning sound of this root word is. So what about these sounds, P, M, and P, inspires this guy to become an M? Why is it changing to M and not P or something else? What do these guys have in common, P and M? And what do they have in common that's different from an N? If you think about it, and the way you should think about it is what sounds you're actually making when you pronounce these things, how you're actually moving your mouth around when you produce them. But for a P and an M, P and M, you close your lips to make those sounds, P and M. One sort of the more salient difference for M from P is that with an M, you actually have air flowing out through your nose at the same time as you're making it as well. So P, air is just going to come through your mouth and kind of get stopped up behind your lips for a brief while, P, and then there's a puff of air letting the air out. For there's no puff of air when you make a because air is consistently flowing out through your nose as you make it. That's how you hum, actually. And you can make an M for as long as you want to, as long as you have enough air in your lungs to keep breathing out. When you make an N, it's similar. There's air that comes out through your nose for an N as well. Hopefully you can hear that. It's like a hum, a little bit different though. The difference is that you don't make a closure with your lips as you say it. You make a closure instead with the front part of your tongue, the very tip of your tongue. You have it reach up and touch. There's a little ridge behind your upper row of teeth. So there's actually a moment where you can kind of stop and kind of get a sense of what the inside of your mouth feels like, and take the tip of your tongue and kind of lick from your teeth as far back as you can go. And in the middle of that, you should feel a kind of ridge behind your upper row of teeth, a little bump on your palate. It's a little bit different for everybody, but for most people, there's some sort of bump there. That is called your alveolar ridge. And when you make an N, you take the tip of your tongue and you kind of squeeze it against that ridge to make a closure in your mouth. So there's no air flowing out through your mouth, but there is air flowing out through your nose. It just sounds different because your tongue is in a different position from an M where you close your lips. So it's in a different spot or place of articulation, as we call it. The trick is when N comes before probable, mobile, so on and so forth, before any word that begins with one of these sounds where you close your lips, then the place of articulation of an N changes from what we call alveolar at the alveolar ridge to bilabial, which means with two lips. So you move the N forward to an M, immobile, to be sort of at the same place as a P or an M. That's the change that's going on here. And that's a lot for me to talk about just by talking about it on a lecture like this. But we're going to review this again when we start up with phonetics in our next sort of unit for this class. But the moral of the story is basically that to explain patterns like this. All right, I got cut off. My disk ran out of space before I could finish that last thought. But I wanted to say that the moral of the story for this particular slide is that to understand what's going on with P's and M's and N's and all the other sounds of the language of English and other languages of the world, we have to figure out how people actually produce those sounds. We have to study what is called phonetics, which is the science of speech, basically. And the reason why is because without that knowledge, we can't explain these patterns in morphology and many other domains of language. It becomes relevant in trying to figure out how the rules of language work. And it's also obviously something you need to know when you're studying language is what do people actually do when they actually utter things so that they make sounds that other people can hear and understand. Okay, I'll give you another example of allomorphy from English before we get into that without sort of a strict explanation or phonetic explanation for why these things happen. But here's another example of a morpheme changing shape or phonetic shape in front of different kinds of roots or words. But we can talk about a dog and we put in front of it to talk about just one general unspecified dog. Or a noise or a strawberry. But then when we apply sort of the same indefinite article to the beginning of these other words like owl, orange, and apple, we talk about an owl, an orange, an apple. So it's no longer but it's n with this n at the end of the word. Why does that appear there? What's going on there? Pause for 5 seconds. bet you probably already know this, maybe, but each one of these words begins with a vowel, right? So when we say an owl, we're kind of just putting a consonant in here to split up two different vowels, which might be a little bit tricky to say otherwise. Owl or orange, apple. Instead we say an owl, an orange, an apple. It's just part of the sort of morphological randomness of English that we put an N there, but that's how it works. Here's another example. So this is, again, going back to past tense formation in English verbs. Walked, invited, sprayed, needed, stopped, hated, fired, landed. Okay, so these are 8 past tenses of different English verbs. And normally the way I walk through this in class is to have you guys figure out first how many syllables are in each of these forms. Walk, walked. We don't add a syllable to that one. Spray, sprayed. We're not adding a syllable to that one when we form the past tense. Stop, stopped. Those are both one-syllable forms. Fire, fired. Those are both one-syllable forms. Invite has 2 syllables. Invited has 3. Need has 1 syllable. Needed has 2. Hate has 1 syllable. Hated has 2. Land has 1 syllable. Landed has 2. Why are we adding syllables in every single one of these cases? What's up with that? I don't really need to drink any water, but I need to take a break. So I will pause for 5 seconds. What's going on with invite, need, hate, and land? Why do they all add another syllable when we create the past tense for those verbs? Maybe you can see the pattern here, but each one of these ends in a T or a D, ta or da, and just kind of focus on how you're producing those with your mouth when you say them. Ta, da, invite, need, hate. You're making a closure at that alveolar ridge again. These are not ends, but they're being produced at the same spot in your mouth. They're called alveolar stops, it turns out, ta or da. D at the end of the past tense suffix is also an alveolar stop. It's made at the same place of articulation. So you're kind of putting an extra vowel in here, just a short one, to kind of split those two sounds up. In theory, because it makes them easier to hear and maybe a little bit easier to say too. So invited, needed, it's easier to say invited rather than invited without that vowel in the middle there. So you kind of add an extra syllable as a result of that. Each one of these examples over here, you have a consonant maybe or a vowel just at the end of the root word that is not at that alveolar place of articulation. So it's easy to say just add the D part of this past tense suffix to the original form of the verb without having to create another vowel in the middle to kind of split that up from the root. Walked, sprayed, stopped, fired. You can think about this, have fun thinking about what you're doing exactly with your mouth when you say these verbs, but you're not making an alveolar stop at the end of them in every single case. Cool. If you saw that pattern, great. If not, we'll talk about the terminology and the specifics of how we produce sounds in language next time, so you can kind of start to get a sense of how that all works. And it takes a while to learn all that because there's a lot of memorization involved, but we'll take it hopefully slowly enough for you to get a handle on it without too much difficulty. Here's another one that's pretty similar. Cats, judges, chairs, matches, dogs, passes. So these are forming the past tense of, these are forming the plural forms of these various nouns. Cats, judges, chairs, matches, dogs, passes, so on and so forth. Some of these, or every single one of these words is a single syllable word in the singular form, but some of these add on another syllable when we create the plural and some of them don't. So cats, dogs, and chairs, those are all one-syllable words in the plural form, but matches, judges, and passes are multi-syllable words. They're two-syllable words in the plural. Why do these guys get an extra syllable? Matches, judges, and passes. Well, based on the last pattern we saw, you might have already kind of inferred the pattern here, but it's based on what sounds these words end in and how similar they are to the S that forms the plural morpheme in English. So match ends in a ch, judge ends in a j, pass ends in a s. These are all what are called sibilant sounds, and it's not quite as easy to find those phonetically as it is like a T or a D, but ch, j, and sh. those are sounds that kind of make a lot of high frequency noise sort of towards the front of your mouth, like s, and they're called sibilant for that reason. And s is a sibilant, like at the end at the end of the plural suffix or the plural suffix by itself. So you add another vowel in the middle of that suffix and a sibilant at the end of a root noun, like ch or sa. Similar to what we saw with the verb past tense formation on the previous slide. So this, interestingly enough, not only applies to plural noun formation, but we know we get a variety of different inflectional affixes in English that are just s by themselves. Like we see it in the third person of the verb as well, in like waits, loves, shows, and finds. And when a verb ends in a sibilant sound like watch or hatch, or kiss or phase, so on and so forth, we add that extra syllable here too. So you say he kisses, or it phases, or so on and so forth. So there's another extra little syllable involving the vowel schwa here that splits up those two sibilant sounds to make them both easier to say and to hear, presumably. So the thing is that it doesn't just matter if this is a noun or a verb. All that matters here really is what combination of sounds we're trying to kind of squeeze together at the end of the word. And then we have sort of a way of dealing with that pattern in English in terms of the way we actually produce the sounds to change the order of the sounds a little bit. And it has nothing to do with the lexical categories of the words that we're dealing with. So it's based entirely on the sounds involved, and that's called a phonological pattern. So the patterns of sound that we see in the way we actually produce words in a language, that's called phonology. Sort of the specifics of how we actually produce them in our mouths, that's the study of phonetics. And we're going to have to deal with or walk through the study of both of those in the next 2 units in this class. But again, we'll try to take it at a reasonable speed so you can kind of get all the information you need without becoming totally overwhelmed by the details. Yeah, but that's what we have to look forward to. And I have a little slide here about the Italian quick write, but I think I will, as long as we're here, we'll walk through it quickly. I lost my little quick write, and yeah. So what's going on here? We've got 3 forms of the definite article. So sometimes it's il, sometimes it's la, and sometimes it's lo. And hopefully you can see that you just get the L apostrophe form when it appears before a word beginning with a vowel. This is sort of like an in English. Otherwise, normally you get il, like il nodo, il re, so on and so forth, il sindaco. But sometimes you get lo, and it's only in a really specific context where you get lo as the form of the definite article, lo zucchero, lo zio, lo zoppo, and it's only when the root begins with a Z, right? So we get allomorphy here in Italian, which is kind of fun. We get 3 forms of this article, il, L apostrophe, and lo, and it's based entirely on the sounds that the root of the noun it's attaching to begins with. All right, I don't think I mangled that too much, so I'm going to stop there while I'm ahead, but I'll see you next time to get started on phonetics. All right. See you later.